LiSTNR production.
An Adelaide man murders his wheelchair-bound wife, leaving her family devastated. A case the sentencing judge described as a despicable act of domestic violence and a case of ultimate evil. I'm Dan Mullins. This is Crime Insider's Judgment, a deep dive on a judge's final verdict of a crime and what transpired to incite that judgment. In this week's judgment, it's the Crown versus Peter Rex Dansie, and an appeal Dansie launched in the Supreme Court against his conviction. In 2017, Peter Dansie and his wife Helen, who used a wheelchair due to a stroke years prior, visited Veal Gardens in Adelaide. Helen drowned in a pond. Her husband claimed it was an accident. But the prosecution argued it was a premeditated murder driven by financial gain and Dansie's desire for a new life. Helen Dansie suffered a stroke in 1995 that left her with permanent disabilities, including cognitive deficits and weakness in her right leg. She required a wheelchair and couldn't return to work. Here, an actor reads from an article written by Peter and Helen's son Grant in Take 5 magazine in 2020.
My parents were polar opposites. Dad, a statistician with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, often threw temper tantrums, but my mother, a hospital microbiologist, was warm and loving. We lived in the Adelaide foothills and had an Angora goat farm nearby. When I was a teenager, some Jack Russells that belonged to local radio host Jeremy Cordeau got in and killed some of the goats, and it wasn't the first time they'd been in the paddock. "I'll teach 'em," Dad thundered. He ended up slitting the dogs' throats. "I would have shot them if I'd had a gun," he said. The awful incident attracted so much misleading media coverage that our family received death threats. Due to the stress, Mum suffered a stroke soon after, leaving her with little short-term memory and only able to speak in short sentences.
Back to the judgment. Helen's condition worsened in 2015, making her totally wheelchair-bound. On that fateful day in Veal Gardens, Dansie positioned his wife's wheelchair on a rock near the edge of a pond. He claimed that while trying to move the chair, it rolled into the water. He jumped into the pond, but couldn't rescue her. The High Court judgment reads, "It was common ground between the parties that on the afternoon of 16 April 2017, Dansie visited his wife at her nursing home and took her on an outing to various locations in Adelaide before travelling to the gardens. There, he positioned his wife in her wheelchair on a rock at the edge of one of the many rock pools in the gardens. He admitted pushing Mrs. Dansie's wheelchair, with her seated in it, into the pond where she drowned. At the time of Mrs. Dansie's death, Dansie, a 68-year-old man, stood at an imposing height of 1.82 metres and weighed around 130 kilograms. Helen Dansie was 67 years old, 1.74 metres tall and weighed 117 kilograms. Mrs. Dansie had limited physical abilities and could only bear weight on her legs for short periods, requiring assistance in many daily tasks. The location where Mrs. Dansie's body was found, a pond near the parklands, was not particularly deep, no more than 1.15 metres. The pond was roughly circular, with its southern edge nestled against a rocky mound. The only practical access to and from the water was from the northern side. A sealed walking path ran along the north edge of the pond, separated from the water by a 10-metre wide grass verge. A rock, known as Rock B in the court, lay at the northern edge of the pond. This rock, measuring 1.6 metres in length and 800 millimetres at its widest point, had a drop leading into the water. Dansie claimed that he'd parked Mrs. Dansie's wheelchair on Rock B so that she could observe the ducks in the pond. When attempting to move the wheelchair, which was in a poor condition, away from the rock, Dansie said that it tipped into the water. Dansie made a 000 call to emergency services shortly before 6:30 p.m. Ambulance officers arrived a short time later, followed by police officers. Mrs. Dansie was located lying face down in the pond. The wheelchair was also in the pond. Dansie was observed as wet to his belly button. There were no eyewitnesses to what had occurred at the pond. The 000 call is important. Dansie made that call at about 6:26 p.m. The call lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The prosecution tendered a disc containing audio of the call and a transcript of the audio. During that call, Dansie stated that he pushed his wife into the pond. He said, "My wife is in a wheelchair and we were just turning around to go home and it was getting dark and I couldn't move her. I said, 'Take the brake off,' and she did, and all of a sudden she wasn't there anymore." The court released a short segment of the audio of the call.
All of a sudden she wasn't there anymore. Okay, where is she now? She's still there. I can't get her out. Has she gone into the pond? Yes. Is she underwater at the moment? Yeah. I just can't get her out.
When the operator suggested he try and lift her head out of the water or sort of tilt her head back, Dansie said, "Look, I just about couldn't get out of the pond myself. I've got back problems with bad legs from diabetes, and the first thing I did was chucked the phone." The operator encouraged him to try and lift her head, try and lift her head up, try and float her up, push her towards the edge of the pond, and push her up against the edge, just try to get her head out of the water to try and help her there. Dansie responded by saying that he had tried those actions, but she was too heavy and she's really heavy. He indicated that she had been under the water for approximately 10 minutes. The operator also suggested that he try and roll her onto her back. When she's underwater, she will be quite buoyant. Just try and roll her. It was at this point that the ambulance officers arrived at the pond. The police later released footage of Dansie being questioned in the moments after his wife was pulled from the pond.
What could you see when she was in the water?
Well, I just, saw her go in.
Yep. And her head was down?
Yeah.
The prosecution alleged that there was a lack of urgency in Dansie's call to the operator, that he expressed no distress at all, and he did not immediately alert the operator to the fact his wife was still in the pond. The trial judge noted, and it was not challenged, that it was approximately 1 minute and 10 seconds into the phone call that the operator was made aware of the fact that Mrs. Dansie was still in the pond. The prosecution suggested the reason why Dansie expressed no interest in getting back into the pond or in attempting to keep his wife's head above water while waiting for the ambulance officers to attend was to ensure that enough time had elapsed so that Mrs. Dansie could not be resuscitated. Ambulance officers arrived at the pond at about 29 minutes past 6. They observed Dansie standing on the northwest side of the pond. As he approached, he turned and pointed at the pond and said, "In there." One of the ambulance officers who attended the scene gave evidence that Dansie told him that it was his wife who was in the pond and that she had been in the pond for about 25 minutes. He said that he'd been in the pond trying to get her out, but was unable to. Dansie explained the circumstances of how his wife came to be in the pond in similar terms to his explanation during the 000 call. One of the ambulance officers, Richard Giles, gave evidence that Dansie said he tried to turn the wheelchair around. He wasn't able to. He asked the patient to take the brakes off. As she'd done that, the wheelchair had rolled into the pond, and he'd been unsuccessful in trying to get her out. Mr. Giles said Dansie also told him that she was wheelchair-bound and that she'd been strapped into the wheelchair. Mr. Giles observed that Dansie was wet up to his belly button, that he appeared quite calm, didn't appear too upset or too panicked, almost looked a little bit deflated, like he was exhausted. The evidence of Mr. Giles was only challenged to the extent that he asserted that Dansie had said Mrs. Dansie was strapped into the wheelchair. The trial judge did not accept the evidence of Mr. Giles on this topic, as the wheelchair did not have straps, and Dansie at no stage during lengthy interviews with the police made such a suggestion. An appeals court later proceeded on the same basis, as this alleged comment is inconsistent with other evidence indicating that the wheelchair had no straps. Additionally, nowhere else in his extensive interviews did Dansie make any such comment. On the prosecution case, Dansie's conversation with the ambulance officers was relevant to demonstrate Dansie's lack of urgency at contacting emergency services after his wife entered the pond. The prosecution sought to draw this inference from the fact that he told Mr. Giles that his wife had been in the pond for about 25 minutes. Considering the arrival time of the ambulance officers, this implied that Mrs. Dansie was in the pond for about 15 to 20 minutes before Dansie made the 000 call to emergency services, which was relevant to show Dansie's lack of urgency in his efforts to rescue his wife. A search of Dansie's car revealed various items, a change of clothes for Dansie, but not for his wife, his wallet containing $400, and an Armani watch. The presence of these items in the car later became a point of contention in the trial, as the prosecution argued that these items indicated premeditation. The trial judge agreed, stating that the presence of these belongings in the car was suspicious. At the initial judge-only trial, the prosecution focused on several key points. First, the positioning of the wheelchair. They argued there was no logical reason to place Mrs. Dansie so close to the water's edge, especially as it was getting dark. They found it suspicious that Dansie had previously tested the depth of other water features in the gardens, suggesting premeditation. Secondly, implausible explanation. The prosecution argued that Dansie's explanation of how the wheelchair entered the water was physically unlikely given the direction he claimed to be pushing it and the location where his wife ended up. Thirdly, failure to rescue. The prosecution questioned why Dansie, an able-bodied man, couldn't save his wife, even if he couldn't pull her out. He could have at least kept her head above water or gone for help sooner. The prosecution highlighted that police divers easily turned Helen's body over in the water. Fourth, a lack of urgency and distress. The prosecution pointed to a perceived lack of urgency in Dansie's 000 call and a general absence of distress in his interactions with authorities. Now, to Dansie's lies and motives. The prosecution suggested two motives for the alleged murder. 1. A desire for a new life. They presented evidence of Dansie's online interactions with a woman named Sophia from China, including sexually suggestive messages and plans to visit her. They also found items in his home, like condoms and lingerie, suggesting a desire for a new romantic relationship. Secondly, the prosecution argued that Dansie stood to benefit financially from Helen's death, including receiving insurance payouts and inheriting their jointly owned properties. They highlighted his disputes with the public advocate over Helen's care and finances, suggesting he viewed her as a burden. More of that testimony later. The defense argued that the prosecution hadn't proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and Dansie's account of an accidental drowning was a reasonable possibility. They emphasized several points. A lack of premeditation. They argued that Dansie's actions, including volunteering incriminating information to police, were inconsistent with a planned murder. They also argued that leaving his watch and wallet in the car was not a sign of premeditation, as he wouldn't have needed them and they would be safe in the locked vehicle. Then there was Dansie's financial security. They argued that the financial motive was weak, as Dansie was financially comfortable and considered himself wealthy. Then there's ongoing care. They pointed out that Dansie had cared for Helen for over 20 years, and while their relationship may have been strained, people in such situations rarely resort to murder. Dansie's defence barrister, Greg Mead, SC, called 2 witnesses who would testify that Dansie was a caring husband who took good care of his wife. Witness Anne Wilk told the court.
Peter was great. The first thing that stood out to me was when we went around for dinner, I asked if I could bring anything. And Peter said, "Can you bring something for Helen? Some flowers or a book?" He always made sure she was included.
Then there was Sophia's influence. The defence downplayed the significance of Dansie's relationship with Sophia, arguing he already had enough freedom to pursue a relationship with her and his interactions were mostly online. The defence talked about a difficult rescue. They acknowledged that Dansie's inability to rescue Helen was surprising, but pointed to his age, weight and physical limitations as factors. Coming up, the verdict and the appeal. The trial judge found Dansie guilty of murder, rejecting his explanation of events and highlighting the circumstantial evidence against him. Dansie was sentenced to life imprisonment with a 25-year non-parole period. However, the case went to the Court of Appeal, where one judge dissented, finding there was a reasonable possibility of an accident. Dansie originally had an appeal against his conviction rejected in South Australia's Court of Appeal in 2020, but he took his fight to the High Court 2 years later, which unanimously found the appeal court misapplied the law, granting him a rehearing. The Court of Appeal in March 2024 ultimately upheld Peter Dansie's conviction. The 3 judges conducted their own review of the evidence, including watching the recordings of Dansie's interviews. Despite acknowledging the circumstantial nature of the case, the court found that the evidence was sufficient to eliminate any reasonable doubt of his guilt. It was a complex case. While there were no eyewitnesses to Helen's death, the circumstantial evidence, inconsistencies in Dansie's account, and his perceived lack of urgency and distress ultimately led to his conviction for murder. In 2020, Dansie was sentenced to life imprisonment with a 25-year non-parole period following a trial by judge alone. Here's Helen Dansie's cousin, Grant Battersby, addressing the media outside the court.
Peter Dansie carefully, coldly, callously planned Helen's murder over weeks and months. He probably didn't expect to be caught and punished. The appeal he lodged on Monday shows that he still doesn't accept his own guilt or show any remorse.
His appeal was handed down in March 2024, meaning he would most likely die in prison. That judgment reads as follows. Dansie had 2 clear motives to commit the offence. First, he had a financial motive to kill his wife. The evidence on this topic needs to be viewed in the context of his increasingly strained relationship with the public advocate. In South Australia, the public advocate promotes the rights and interests of people who need assistance with decision-making. It gives information, resolves disputes, advocates, investigates, and acts as a guardian of last resort. In 2015, the South Australian Civil and Administrative Tribunal appointed Mr. Dansie and the public advocate as joint guardians of Mrs. Dansie. By mid-March 2017, the public advocate had advised Mr. Dansie that she may review the administration order and undertake an investigation into Mrs. Dansie's finances. An application was filed with the Civil and Administrative Tribunal to vary the guardianship order to make the public advocate the sole guardian and have the public trustee appointed to manage her finances on the 28th of March, listed for hearing in July 2017. Additionally, Dansie was aware by mid-March that the public advocate was considering moving Mrs. Dansie into a different nursing home at increased cost. A new public advocate was assigned to Mrs. Dansie, and there was to be increased focus on Dansie's treatment of his wife. Dansie was challenged by the public advocate about his refusal to pay for the cost of his wife attending the funerals of her brother and cousin. Additionally, her need for eyeglasses and physiotherapy were raised with him. Furthermore, there was the prospect, if unsuccessful in the civil and administrative tribunal proceedings, that he would lose sole control of her finances to the public trustee. Let's go back to Grant Dansie's article in Take 5 magazine.
I fought to improve Mum's care through the official channels like the public trustee. The process went on for years. Dad would make promises about Mum's finances or care, but never kept them and didn't face any consequences. It was outrageous. He'd even used $5,000 of Mum's money to buy a tractor. When I was finally allowed to visit Mum, I noticed she smelled. Her clothes were unwashed and her hair was matted. Dad clearly wasn't looking after her properly. Years passed before Mum was temporarily admitted to a nursing home, which brought me some relief. Dad fought to get Mum back home so he could control her finances and care, but his plan didn't work out, and she stayed at the nursing home. By then, I mostly communicated with Dad through the authorities and lawyers. When I tried to talk to him about Mum's care, he'd either get angry or stay quiet. 2 years on, the public advocate was declared Mum's joint guardian, which meant authorities had a shared say in her care and finances. It was a win, but then I filed for a review of Dad's role as guardian altogether. If we won, he'd lose all control over Mum.
Shortly after, a family friend called Grant to say Helen had passed away. The court judgment reads, "While it is to be accepted that there was no evidence that Dansie did not provide an adequate level of care to his wife, there was evidence that there was an increasing level of scrutiny in Mrs. Dansie's care and living conditions in the months and weeks preceding her death. The matter was to be the subject of litigation, which would have cost implications for Dansie and could result in him losing control of his wife's finances. Moreover, if moved to another nursing home, there would be additional costs." Further on it says, Dansie also stood to receive significant financial benefits upon Mrs. Dansie's accidental death. These included being able to claim $15,000 from Freedom Insurance and receiving a pension for the term of his life equivalent to 2/3 of that payable to his wife had she lived, and the 3 properties held in joint names would revert to him. The judges said they had not overlooked the submissions that Dansie considered himself a wealthy man and had no obvious need for an injection of money. However, the financial benefits he stood to receive upon his wife's death were relatively significant. Furthermore, her death put an end to the civil and administrative tribunal proceedings, which would have potentially resulted in additional costs and a loss of his control over her finances. Dansie also had a relationship motive to commit the offence, that is, his interest in pursuing a sexual relationship with another woman, in particular, Sophia. The content of the messages between Dansie and Sophia, combined with his internet searches for sexy heels, revealed the intimate nature of their association. Crown Prosecutor Jim Pearce said Mr. Dansie had searched the internet for sexual role-playing games, thigh-high boots, cheap sale, and sexy 6-inch stiletto sale in the weeks before Mrs. Dansie's death. Furthermore, Dansie had his sister maintain contact with Sophia after his wife's death, and he arranged to travel to China to meet up with her. The contents of his travel suitcase support the inference that his interest in Sophia was sexual. The suitcase contained condoms, sex toys, and Viagra. The judgment reads, "As to Dansie's submission that he did not need to kill his wife to pursue extramarital affairs, and many persons conduct such liaisons without resorting to murder, so much is true. But it would have been difficult for Dansie to pursue a sexual relationship with a woman who lived in China while remaining the husband, carer, and legal guardian of his wife. Moreover, divorcing his wife would have had financial implications, and to that extent, the financial and relationship motives are interconnected. The appeal court judges considered Dansie's submission that if he was subjectively motivated to commit the offence for financial and personal reasons, he would not have engaged in post-offence conduct which drew attention to those motives. However, contrary to this submission, Dansie's post-offence conduct in making his insurance claims and arranging to travel to China in fact underscored his motives to commit the offence. The appeal judges said, following our independent review of all the evidence, including Dansie's denials and version of events provided to emergency services personnel and during the police interviews, and after having regard to the submissions of both parties, we are satisfied the evidence was sufficient in nature and quality to eliminate any reasonable doubt that Dansie was guilty of the offence of murder. We are satisfied, as a result of our own assessment of the whole of the evidence adduced at trial, that the only rational inference available on the evidence was that Dansie deliberately pushed the wheelchair into the pond with an intention to kill his wife. In 2020, Grant Dansie told Take 5 magazine,
Mum was disabled and a victim of her controlling husband. She didn't fall through a crack in the system, it was a gaping hole. Despite all my efforts, the authorities did little to protect her. Mum didn't need to die, but because the system failed her, she was taken from me by my own merciless father.
Peter Dansie died in prison in May 2024, 2 months after his appeal was dismissed, 7 years after the death of his wife. Peter Dansie's son Grant said,
He died where he belongs.
Thanks for listening to Crime Insider's Judgements. We love hearing your feedback, so please rate and review this episode. If you have a case you want us to cover, let us know via Instagram at LiSTNR Crime or TikTok at LiSTNR Crime Team. I'll be back again next Thursday with another case. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.